So in this video, guys, I want to discuss BEE, which I think is one of the most important conversations in our political discourse, and hence, it's in the news again, and it's a topical thing. Once again, the DA coming forward and saying, no, we want to present to South Africans a brand new version of this BEE approach. And that's what I just want to focus on. In fact, I just thought I would look at it as ANC's version of BEE versus the DA's version of BEE following the announcement, and then I'll give my judgment in terms of which is better. So ANC's version of BEE, firstly, I am fully aware that once obviously BEE became into law in 2003, it then became a law, a South African law that applies to everyone, whether you're ANC or not. So the ANC version, just to firstly just do a recap of that, is inspired by, or the framework itself is rooted in ANC's own policy or ideological standpoint. And also, it was passed under an ANC-led government back in the year 2003. In addition to that, there is what we call the BEE Commission, or BEECOM. This commission here produced a report in 2001, which became the blueprint for the BEE Act. This report that was produced by the BEECOM was commissioned by the ANC itself, chaired by Cyril Ramaphosa, who is our now president, and also presented directly to the ANC leadership before it was tabled in Parliament. That just becomes a really critical framework in understanding the design of BEE as it is now the law that is applicable to all South Africans. In terms of the provisions of this ANC version of BEE, I mentioned the fact that it came into effect in the year 2003. The preamble of this BEE states that it aims to promote the constitutional right to equality, increasing broad-based and effective participation of Black people in the economy, promoting a higher growth rate, increased employment, and more equitable income distribution. So off the bat, this BEE version of the ANC, from the ANC, 100% credible. It is backed by our constitution, backed by the need, so to say, right, to be able to address the past, where we come from. Another point that I found to be really interesting here is the strong reliance or emphasis of the fact that it is the businesses, right? BEE is a law or legislation that addresses businesses. Again, there is that dependency, right? Businesses are evaluated according to what the law states here, evaluated across ownership, management control, skills, development, enterprise and supply development, socioeconomic development, as another sort of criteria here in which allows BEE to evaluate businesses according to this criteria. Keyword businesses. Again, there is that reliance. Third clause or third element of this BEE of the ANC is that it is also based on a scoring, right? Companies receive a triple BEE level certificate, which influences access to government procurement, licensing, and other benefits. There are, 4 or 5 elements within this, within BEE, the law itself, and each element carries a particular weight. Element 3 for me is what I would say is quite constructive, even if it's, within this BEE, which is really contentious, BEE law, which is quite contentious. But element 3 is constructive and I think a real game changer for anyone, I believe, anyone, Black, white, whichever country you're born in, whichever economy you exist in, the fact that it speaks to skills development, it speaks to training, that is something that will always be yours. Like when you learn and get knowledge, no one can ever strip that away from you. And even if it does not necessarily mean you're going to take that knowledge and apply it in our context or in benefit South Africa's economy, the benefit is that it's yours, which means you can get on a flight tomorrow and go use it elsewhere. Like we're seeing a boom of young female teachers going over to China to use their skills, right? So I think that becomes quite important. Lastly, the ANC version of BEE states that while companies are not forced, there are consequences which present themselves, in my view, almost like a sanction, right? Because what essentially this means is that if you choose not to comply with BEE, you are not forced to. By law, you're not forced. However, it's pretty much, you don't really have a lot of options, because even if you as a company do not, for you to trade with another company that maybe has managed to get a high BEE level score, you working with that company could mean a lot of issues for that particular company. They could be degraded down. And there's also reputational risks, fronting, if you are seen or is suspected of fronting in order to get ahead without necessarily doing the transformation or doing the change. There are guaranteed penalties that are there for people who are caught fronting, which means that it's quite hostile, right? It's quite hostile, and it doesn't really give you a lot of options, especially if you are existing in South Africa's market. Basically, the way I look at it is that it is making compliance a cost, not necessarily an opportunity, right? Which is where the tension is. And by cost, I mean businesses do this because they have to. They would likely comply with BEE because they want to stay in operation. They want to be able to have a good reputation. They want to be able to be, get that flexibility to work with that supplier and that supplier without having the limitations of the BEE level score, which becomes compliance for cost, compliance to stay ahead, a compliance to stay in operation, as opposed to compliance as an opportunity, right? Because if it was an opportunity, you would even need to tell businesses to comply to this. Then we get to the DA's version of BEE, which was presented recently, and they're calling it the Economic Inclusion for All Bill, right? That is their iteration. And here, they're saying here that instead of BEE, they're presenting what they call value for money and economic inclusion, now accounting for 100%, right? So the criteria only lists two things: value for money, which is a weighting of 80%, and economic inclusion, which is a weighting of 20%. You remember the ANC weighting, they had about 6 or 7 elements, each having their own weighting. I did speak to the fact that the skills development and the training aspect, that element becomes really critical, because that is just giving someone just the right foundation. When you give them knowledge, that is the right foundation. DA coming in and saying, well, no, we are just going to phrase it by value for money and economic inclusion. Within value for money, which is the strongest weighting of 80%, this then speaks to best price, technical capability, reliable track record, innovation, capacity to deliver, compliance, and a compliance and risk profile. That is the highest weight. So if you tick all of these boxes, you should be good to go. Economic inclusion, on the other hand, which is a weighting of 20%, addresses poverty and hunger, better skills in education, jobs, supplier development, infrastructure investment, save and deliver water for community, energy projects and savings and recycling, which is also some sort of a sustainability scoring there as well in the mix. And I mean, so far so good. So far so good. If I was a business owner, which I do tend to wear that hat a lot, even if I am not an entrepreneur at this point, I do tend to, put myself in the business owner's shoes. This, for me, in terms of the way the DA has written it, reads quite clearly. And, of course, the more clear, the more layman, the more transparent in terms of what it is that you want from me as someone who's operating in your market, the better, right? As opposed to how the ANC sometimes tends to frame these things, you could, you're not forced to, but you can. Yeah, there's a lot of ambiguity at times, right, which I think can also be a disadvantage. And the fact that it is a lot of elements that the ANC is presenting. So ownership, that is a really, really interesting element, because ownership meaning what? I give up what I have, question mark, that is a weighting of 25 points, according to what the ANC is putting on the table. Management control, yes, I do understand this one here. Where it's saying that you need to increase the representation, a scoring of 19%, right? Socioeconomic development, ACD, I spoke to skills, and then also enterprise and supplier development, which has a higher scoring here, basically saying that enterprise development is the amount spent on developing small Black-owned enterprises. Again, there is a strong, reliance by the ANC's version on compliance as a cost as opposed to compliance as an opportunity, which I feel that the DA's bill becomes sort of the opposite to that. DA is saying, if you are a value for money guy, if you are strong in capability, if you can be reliable, track record, innovation, you can win. And I think, that really, really attracts the right kind of people. It attracts the right mindset. in terms of who gets to work with the state or who gets to get higher preference. It's the right profile. People who value these things are the right profile. But I also just want to state that both ANC's version and the DA's version, right, is rooted in what our Constitution states, right? Section 9, Clause 2 of the Constitution. To read verbatim, it says here that to promote the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures designed to protect or advance persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination may be taken. So essentially what's happening here, right, is that the ANC, their framework, which again now has become the law that South Africa has adopted, their framework is looking at the person's disadvantage, which is what our Constitution says, that legislative and other measures can be designed to advance the person's disadvantage. ANC saying person's disadvantage is a racial sort of term. They're looking at it from a racial point of view. Hence, BE clearly stipulates that it is black owned or black business and all of that, right? So the emphasis of black, which is a broader term accommodating not just black people, but colored Indians as well, or people of color, right? So that is the first point. Both DA and ANC are taking their direction from this particular foundation or this framework that is now our Constitution giving the directive. One is saying the person's disadvantage is a racial term. The DA is saying, no, person disadvantaged is an economic term, meaning we're taking based on those who need the most. Things like, okay, if you, you haven't traded or your turnover is lower, that becomes a higher preference as opposed to people who have been trading, people who are already big, right? Which kind of like opens up a window to bring in more smaller businesses, more startups, given that, of course, they qualify with all of the other things that the DA wants. That becomes a distinction, right? But personally, for me, where both of these bills, that the one the ANC, the one that's based on ANC's framework, the one that the DA is presented, where both of them become problematic is on the part of discretion, right? The mere fact that whether you are looking at preference on race or preference on need, someone somewhere has to make that determination, right? And likely a government official has to make the determination that business A qualifies because business A meets the needs criteria. Or in the case of the ANC's bill, business A qualifies because they meet the black criteria, right? So this discretion becomes a really, really big problem because this is where the window for corruption becomes wide open, right? Hence, we are in this mess in the first place because it is humans who are going to need to administer that. It is humans who are going to give you a rating. It's not like some AI automatic system where you just punch, and then things happen. Even if you make the process as transparent, even if before you award a tender, for example, you have a press conference, let me tell you, human beings are human beings. Someone is always going to try to, figure a way around. In fact, there's a term that is used a lot by economists, which is called moral hazard, right? Which this term essentially what it's saying here in relation to the BE conversation, that when people know that for them to get preference, they need to tick any of the boxes, for example, then they adapt their behavior, right, to that standard. So as opposed to someone saying, well, for me to get ahead, I need to just make sure that I'm doing my best, my price is right, I'm learning, I'm growing. What then people do is that they adjust their objectives to meet this criteria. That becomes what takes precedence. That's what becomes more important for businesses to say, hey, let's make sure we are compliant. Let's make sure that we are not hurting our BE level score. Again, that is the problem of having preference, whether it's preference on race or preference on need. I just think that both of this, whether it's in the ANC's version or the DA's version, both of these essentially will lead to the same thing. The famous saying that says that a rising tide lifts everyone, I think becomes really, really cool to close off this discussion, that a rising tide lifts everyone. My suggestion, ideally for me, would be to scrap any preference on businesses, whether it's through the licensing, that should go completely. No preference to anyone. And two, for us to just really, really, really be committed on growth as opposed to preference and all of these things, which kind of opens up the idea or the question of, is our constitution positioned to allow for us to grow, or is our constitution designed to keep us as a third world country, as a developing country forever, right? Because if that's the case, we want to be a successful developing country. We want to be a successful third world country. But I think the mentality of growth becomes critical, because when the tide rises, it lifts everyone, rich and poor. Okay, guys, I'm going to leave it at that for this video. And in terms of the verdict, for me, it is no preference or limiting preference completely. And secondly, focusing on growth. Those are the two things that I think are far more better suited in terms of securing a better future, as opposed to saying, well, we'll move preference from race to need. I think you still have the same problem. I do feel that the DA's bill is a more responsible shift, especially if we take the last 30 years as a lesson. But because of that discretionary point, because someone still has to determine who needs more than the other person, I think there is a big opportunity, a big window there for there to be some level of corruption, which I think can also, bring us to the same position. I'm just a bit cautious for that particular reason. But thanks for hanging out. Like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I'll see you guys again pretty soon.